Welcome to another edition of Boom and Bust with Tony Clement. I'm your host on the News Forum. It's great to have you along for another show. We're going virtual, of course, and outside of the studio for another week. Hope to be back in the studio at some point, but in the meantime, we're all in our own home surroundings. With me today is Mr. Bruce Maclellan. He is the founding CEO of Proof Inc., which is a public relations and communications firm. Our topic today is an annual survey that Proof Inc. does called the Can Trust Index Study. And so the 2020 edition is out. It's all about how we perceive leaders in our society and how much we trust them. That is to say, not only political leaders, but corporate leaders, societal leaders, media, and so forth. So a very interesting study and very appropriate in this age of COVID. Bruce, thank you and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's exciting to be appearing on this great new media outlet. So thanks for the invitation.
It's our honor to have you, and maybe we can have you back because we're always looking for great content. So Bruce, tell us a little bit about the 2020 Can Trust Index Study.
Right. So this is our 5th annual study of trust in Canada, and we do an annual survey of 1,500 Canadians, which gives us a good, robust sample. We often oversample particular areas of the population to learn more about those particular groups. And our goal, Tony, is to have the deepest and most Canadian study of trust. Trust is a hot topic nowadays. You hear about it a lot. You see it referred to. People refer to trust in everyday conversation often. But what we find is that there was a lack of deep understanding around trust in Canada with our unique population traits and also with the uniquely Canadian institutions that we have. So we've been doing this study for 5 years, tracking trust and looking at how it differs from segment to segment across our country. We have found overall a story of stable trust in Canada. And there have been some areas where in all 5 years, we found it quite consistent and stable, not necessarily plummeting the way we've seen trust fall in some other parts of the world. But that's why we do tracking studies, because every year is like opening a present with a new surprise in it.
Well, and that's very interesting because sometimes because we do as Canadians, we're mass consumers of media, not only Canadian media, but also international, particularly American media. And if you would have solely relied on that, your impression would have been that trust is plummeting. But you found something different, didn't you?
We did. And particularly a couple of years ago when, distrust, the loss of trust had, led to the election of a new president, a strong sense of America needing to be fixed, a loss of trust. People often lose trust when they feel they're being left behind economically. So economic insecurity, job disruption, those are big drivers of declining trust. And we saw that happen in the United States. We saw it happen in the United Kingdom with Brexit. So what we saw in Canada, on the other hand, was a stable picture where people did feel still that they were trusting our institutions, they were trusting of government, and they did not have this same sense of alienation that we saw. So that's a perfect example, as you say, of why we feel we need to do a uniquely Canadian study. Another perfect example of a Canadian difference is for 5 years, we've consistently found that newcomers to Canada are higher in their trust level across the board than people who are born here. And I describe the 300,000 or so newcomers that we have come to Canada every year as an infusion of trust into our body politic every year. And it's exciting to see these newcomers who are coming to Canada and bringing that positive attitude of trust across the board in corporations, in their fellow citizens, and in their governments.
That is a remarkable finding. Could you drill down a little bit now? I hesitate to use the phrase horse race, but there are different trust levels for media, for politicians, for corporate leaders, which we're very interested in here at Boom and Bust, and for other institutions like healthcare givers. Why don't you give us the top line on those?
Yes, I'd be pleased to. So each year we track trust levels in what we consider to be the key institutional sectors of our country and of our economy. And unfortunately, the areas around trust in CEOs and trust in large corporations are in a worrying state of consistent decline. And this year we saw trust in CEOs at the lowest level it had ever been in our study, down in the range of 30%. And that was when we asked people in the workforce about their own CEO, their own most senior leader in their organization. So we're not just asking about some random imaginary figure of a CEO. We're asking people in the workforce about their own CEO. So it's quite troubling. And we drilled down further on that trust in CEOs by doing a second study this year of 1,000 employees in Canada. And one of the questions we asked them was to give a letter grade, like a report card, on how they think their own company or organization does at building trust inside the organization. And the overall score was a C. So not only was it a C overall, but among the lower paid people and the younger people, it was a C minus. And what that tells us is that, the younger folks, the leaders of tomorrow, are not trusting the leaders of today in our own workplaces. So, one of our conclusions is that for the business world, and I know that's who your show is reaching, there really needs to be a more serious discussion around the deliberate ways you can build trust and track that. It's like what Jack Welch said: what gets measured gets done. There's not enough measurement of trust happening inside our corporations about the overall organization and about the leaders. And then, boards of directors should be tracking that as part of CEO performance.
We're going to get back to some of the demographic differences in 1 second, but I do want to relate. How do CEO trust levels relate to media trust levels and political trust levels? Just to give us, again, part of that baseline.
Right. So we looked at scoring trust with a range of voices in society, and we also have some updated information on since the pandemic began. So we do our annual study every January and early February, and then of course this year that was just as COVID-19 was unfolding in North America. We also then have gone into the field and done an update on May 1-2, so quite recent for this show. What we find is that in January, the most trusted figures in our society were medical doctors and scientists. And, that's very encouraging because,
and that was pre-COVID.
Pre-COVID, yes. So their trust levels were in the, high 50s, 60% trust level, which, comparatively, you have CEOs around 30. Then over the 8 or 9 weeks, we did the survey again and asked about trust levels in medical doctors and scientists, and it has jumped by 12, 15 points, so that we now see the scientists and doctors in what I'm calling the trust stratosphere, levels of trust that we've never seen for any individual or organization in our study before, where their trust levels are up around 78, 80%. Meanwhile, trust in government has also popped up slightly during the pandemic, not to the same proportion, but after a period of years of sort of stability at around 40%, we saw a modest jump in trust in government from during the pandemic period. up about 5 points to the mid 40s. So it seems that during this time when Canadians are inviting medical doctors into their homes every day by turning on the news for those daily briefings, they're appreciating what they're hearing, and their trust is growing in those officials. And I think it's why it's been a very smart approach for, we've seen leaders like Premier Ford in Ontario really working hand in glove with his medical officials and providing great leadership by cooperating and listening to medical officials, and then making the tough decision about what's best for the province. I think that's a very smart approach by political leaders such as Mr. Ford.
Yeah, no, it definitely has changed the baseline, as it were, impression of Doug Ford for a lot of people, and he has been very careful to be deferential to the expert advice he's getting. So that, in a sense, you borrow trust as a political leader from that cohort. Let's talk a little bit about the demographic conclusions you have, Bruce. By the way, I'm speaking with Bruce Maclellan, a founding CEO of Proof Inc., about their study of trust levels in Canada. So I think you made the point in your briefing on this that younger Canadians' views are very different from older Canadians. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, and to some degree, this is a natural event in that the studies of trust show us that trust is something of an attained trait. So we usually see in our studies that trust levels are higher among older members of the population, say people 50 years of age and older. And that's because you partly establish trust through your life experiences. Now, you could have life experiences that undermine trust, but fortunately, that's a minority of our population. For most people, when they go through life, they acquire trust and gain trust, and therefore that we see older segments usually having higher levels of trust in most questions. But I think there's an economic issue at work here, which it might deal with cost of living, it might deal with cost of housing, it might deal with a sense of employment opportunities. But we are seeing younger people who are showing consistently lower levels of trust. And that's something to watch for, because it might be just a stage of age, but I think it also could be an issue of values. And, younger generation are coming up with different expectations of what they want out of life and what they want to see from institutions. So, for example, we know that younger people would say that the values of their employer are just as important as how much they're paid in their job. We know that there's a growth, among young people that say the businesses that I buy products from or buy services from, they will want to seek similar values in those companies as my own. So, there's an age and stage issue here with trust, but there's also a change of values. And our advice to businesses is make sure you understand the values of all your audiences. And it's, it's the concentric circle. Start with your employees, then, perhaps your shareholders, then your customers, and then your communities where you operate. And you need to understand the values of each of your audiences as part of how you map out your trust building strategy.
Right. So that's an important point, because really, when you're an entrepreneur, perhaps, or a business leader, you're always looking at the customer and the client, and making sure that you understand where they're coming from. But it's also about how you interact with your own employees to build up that trust, because they're your ambassadors in a lot of cases. Is that right?
You're absolutely right, Tony. They are your ambassadors, and I know you're very connected to technology and how it's changed the world. This raises another issue in the dynamic of trust, and that is that we are seeing, on a regular basis, cases where employees have lost trust in their own company, and technology is enabling them to become whistleblowers. And the transparency the scrutiny on companies now is unprecedented. So, the great example, and it's ironic because it's a tech company, was, when Cambridge Analytica was first unfolding and Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook was saying, oh, no, nothing to worry about, no problem here. It was the Facebook employees who blew the whistle and said, no, that's not true. There is something to worry about here. We're not comfortable. And then, of course, it all unraveled, and we ended up seeing public apologies from Mr. Zuckerberg. So, if you don't have trust with your employees, and if you're not walking the talk about what you're saying, nowadays they will call you on it. They'll call you on it internally first, maybe, but they'll call you on it publicly if they feel they have to. So it's an absolutely essential audience to start with. And again, that's another example of the rising change of values among younger people and their expectations.
I'd like to discuss the regional differences you found as well, because I think it tells us a little bit about where the stresses and strains are, not only economically, but also in the political fabric of our country. What did you find there?
Yes, great question. And, like you, Tony, I'm a proud Canadian, and I'm always, keen on studying Canada and looking at how Canada, knits together and stays united as the great country we are. We have seen in the last few years the really difficult economic circumstances in our western provinces, particularly the oil producing provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan. Those challenges have been influencing the trust scores. So what we've seen in the last couple of years is a decline of trust among people in Alberta and Saskatchewan, most notably. And they're suffering, and it's really difficult, and they're frustrated about how pipelines can't get built, and they're frustrated by the drop of global oil prices and so on, and it's creating real hardship. So their lack of trust is very understandable. What's interesting, though, is that their trust has fallen, not just, say, in the Prime Minister, which, from a political point of view, you would expect, but their trust has also fallen in corporations or in CEOs. So, they're not just having a kind of a visceral partisan reaction to this situation. It's affecting their trust across the board with all the major institutions, corporations, government, courts, the news media. It's quite widespread. Now, the good news, and this is what I wanted to get to about our country, is one of the drivers of trust is a sense of identity. So to the extent you have an identification with that body, you're more likely to trust it. So in our study this year, we asked people about their level of identification with their country, with Canada. And what I was really pleased to see was that in all the provinces except Quebec, people have a really strong identification with Canada as being Canadian citizens. And that is a strong driver of trust. So we see that the people with the highest identification with Canada have the highest trust scores across the board. In Quebec, understandably, because of the distinct society and the cultural differences, there's a much greater identification with Quebec and the Quebec culture than there is with, the Canadian identification is secondary to that. But, we're seeing that Albertans still identify with Canada strongly, but they're feeling economic frustration at the moment, and that's hurting the trust levels. That has translated then into political support, where yes, you do see that trust levels among people who define themselves as Conservative Party supporters are lower than the trust levels of people who define themselves as Liberal Party supporters. And in
so there's also a divide according to your party support.
Yes, but we think it's because there's a divide in party support along economic lines. Right now, it just so happened that the area of greatest economic hardship is also the area of greatest Conservative Party strength. So, it's important to differentiate that the driver is more likely the economic hardship, not the political identification.
I see. So there's a correlation rather than a causation.
Exactly. Well said. We saw that there was a higher level of a lower level of trust in Atlantic Canada last year, even though we know that that's a region that's very strong in the support of the Liberal Party nationally. Their trust levels in Alberta probably would go up slightly if there was a national Conservative government in Ottawa. It remains to be seen if it would go up that much. We do see interesting changes in trust levels after elections. And if you're willing to let me just go down that path for a moment.
Sure.
We track trust levels in government by province and nationally. So when we look at the trust levels, say in premiers, there's a correlation between popularity and trust. What happens though is that a change of government isn't an automatic guarantee of an increase in trust. For example, in the last couple of years, we saw an election in Alberta where a new premier came in, and yes, there was a spike in trust in the provincial government. We saw the same happen in Quebec, where change of premier, a spike in trust in that province's government. On the other hand, in Ontario, we had a low level of trust in the former premier. We had a change of government, and a year later, the new premier was still mired at the same low trust level. Now, as we've already touched on in our discussion today, I think there's a good chance that the current premier of Ontario has increased his trust levels during this pandemic period, and I'll be excited to see our next survey to test that theory.
I'm speaking with Bruce Maclellan. He's my guest today here on Boom and Bust. He is the founding CEO of Proof Inc., and we're talking about trust levels as measured and quantified in the 2020 CAN Trust Index study. Bruce, I only have you for another couple of minutes, but I did want to again touch on COVID because I think we can separate the world now before COVID and after COVID. Because so much has changed economically, politically, socially, everything has changed. So moving forward with COVID with us for the foreseeable future in some form or another, and certainly the economic devastation that it has wrought with us, what would your advice be to business leaders and other leaders based on your trust surveys?
Right. Well, I think about this question a lot in my everyday because, in addition to our survey that I'm talking about with you today, I'm also a CEO. I'm part of an organization that we've built up to have over 200 employees, and I have to worry every day about the health and well-being of my employees first and foremost, and then how do we operate as a business and stay as a viable business. So I think that what business leaders need to do is, first and foremost, be sure that they are following the advice of the scientists and medical health experts. Right now in our society, these are the most trusted people. And if you can align your steps in your business around how you're going to operate as we come out of the lockdown, you need to be correlating with what is the advice of local public health officials, Canada's National Public Health Officer. All of these people you need to align your steps with to make sure that you can prove to your employees that you are putting their health and well-being foremost. And then you're going to figure out how your business can operate in a manner that serves your customers and continues to be a part of our economy. So the other thing is, in a crisis, you can never communicate too much. Nobody will ever say to you, gosh, Mr. CEO or Ms. CEO, I'm hearing from you too often this week. I would really encourage leaders to be out talking to their people, explaining why they're doing things, sharing about what's happening in the business and what are they facing, and helping with the transparency so that your employees will understand why you're doing what you're doing and be more comfortable with it. And I think they'll reward you with hard work and support as a result.
That's great advice. And of course, we've all been receiving the emails from everyone we've ever interacted with about how they're being part of the COVID solution. But I think your point is well taken. I think we do expect in times of distress and crisis for our leaders, including corporate leaders, to be communicative with us. So with that, Bruce Maclellan, thank you for being on Boom and Bust. Very interesting program. We look forward to having you back on perhaps a bit further down the line when COVID is a little bit more behind us, perhaps, and we're focused on the economic entrails because certainly we're going to be in very interesting economic times over the next few months and years. So thank you for being part of our program.
It's been great talking to you, Tony. Thank you.